T like pure late 1990s Hollywood ambition at full speed. A legendary TV title, reborn as a glossy sci-fi blockbuster. A family sent into the unknown, a spacecraft massive enough to feel like a city drifting through space, a robot designed to become unforgettable, a villain who treats every threat like a stage performance. The film throws planets, monsters, twisted timelines, and futuristic spectacle onto the screen, with that era's belief that bigger always meant better. But underneath all the chrome and cosmic shine, the movie was reaching for something far larger than a simple remake. Don West was never supposed to be played by Entity, known celeb. Matt LeBlanc owed Jonathan Harris one very specific reason. And even now, deleted scenes still exist that many fans have never seen. Fragments of the movie floating around like signals lost in deep space. These are 14 weird facts you didn't know about Entity, movie. Lost in space, aged for the stars, and ended up somewhere far stranger. Stay until the end to see how huge this franchise was meant to become. 1. New Line saw more than nostalgia. New Line cinema movie, Lost in Space, remembered the old television show. The studio saw an opportunity. The title already had recognition. The Robinson family was already established. Dr. Smith and the robot were instantly familiar names. That meant audiences didn't need to be taught the basics from scratch. The brand already carried the promise of space adventure, family danger, and classic sci-fi. Just the name itself could start selling tickets before the first trailer had even ended. If this had been a completely original science fiction film, the studio would have needed to build the world, characters, and mythology from nothing. Instead, Lost in Space gave them a head start. The concept already existed. The title had history. The imagery was already built into pop culture memory. But New Line wanted more than a remake. It wanted a large-scale space property that could stand in the same conversation as the major sci-fi franchises of the era. Not because it could instantly become Entity, movie. Star Wars, Star Trek, the studio understood that recognizable science fiction brands had enormous value. Nostalgia helped, but the real attraction was the shortcut. New Line looked at an old TV series and saw a ready-made launchpad for something much bigger. 2. The first real clue was the budget P told audiences everything. This was not a small revival pretending to be something larger. Production began in March 1997 at Entity, Point of Assumptions, Shepperton Studios. Tedley rose to around $80 million for a 1998 release based on an old television property. At the time, that was a serious gamble. Entity Company, New Line Cinema, as a modest update for nostalgic viewers. It was pouring money onto the screen, hoping the scale alone would make the title feel brand new. And you can clearly see where that money went. The visual effects plan was enormous, with more than 750 effects shots handled across multiple companies instead of one single effects house. The production used everything available in late 1990s filmmaking: CGI, animatronics, miniatures, motion control, and compositing. It was like the studio tried to build one giant science fiction showcase using every tool of the era. Then there was the hardware. The new Jupiter 2 was redesigned on a much larger scale, and the production created a physical ship model roughly 70 feet long, 26 feet wide, and 17 feet tall. Large enough to feel like a real place instead of just a prop. Inside, full multi-level interiors were built at Shepperton with actual walls, textures, and room for the cast to move naturally. Once the story reached the alien planet, large outdoor sets were also constructed, giving actors real terrain rather than asking the entire movie to exist on empty blue screen stages. Even the retractable helmets used double photography and compositing rather than a quick digital shortcut. The production kept adding practical weight wherever possible, then layered early digital effects over the top. That is why the film still feels divided today. Some scenes hold up because you can sense the real construction underneath. The ship feels massive, the sets feel solid, but when the movie leans harder into ambitious CGI, especially creatures like Blarp or Spider-Smith, you can feel the late 1990s digital risk showing through. They spent enough money to make it big, just not enough to make it timeless. 3. Don West wasn't supposed to be Matt LeBlanc shot pilot, the smooth talker, the character the movie leans on whenever all the steel danger and family tension become too heavy. But here's the strange part. At first, the role did not belong to entity known celeb. Matt LeBlanc in Ollie gone to entity people. See Sean Patrick Flannery change direction. Director entity people. St. Stephen Hopkins RY lacked the physical presence needed to serve as a convincing counterbalance to entity. Known celeb William Hurt Ved. He looked too visually similar to Hurt, sharing comparable features and coloring. In a film already built around a strong family dynamic, that became enough reason to recast the role. Then LeBlanc entered the project, bringing an entirely different energy. He was not arriving as just another cast member. He came with the popularity of Entity TV show. Friends Antley gave the movie a face audiences already recognized, trusted, and understood quickly. Don West needed that. The role has to connect fast, swagger, charm, and just enough relaxed confidence to cut through all the heavy production design and keep the film feeling human. LeBlanc could deliver that in seconds. The challenge was that the production did not get him full-time. Lost in Space was filming in the United Kingdom, while Friends kept pulling him back to the United States. He was constantly crossing the Atlantic, trying to keep both productions alive at once. That placed the film in an awkward position. It had replaced one actor with a more marketable star, then had to work around the fact that the star might not always be available. In one sequence, Don West wears a helmet, and the crew realized it could solve a practical problem. If LeBlanc had to leave and missed a filming day, they could place a double in the suit, hide him under the helmet, and continue shooting. But that backup plan never became necessary. LeBlanc kept making the trips himself, showing up when needed, and filming his scenes rather than forcing the production to rely on the workaround. So in the end, the helmet became more than a costume detail. It became insurance the movie barely needed. And the recasting decision ultimately worked. 4. Gary Oldman was fighting a bigger battle off-screen. Known celeb. Gary Oldman, a man decaying from the inside out. Off-screen, he was trying to hold himself together. By the time filming began at Entity, Point and Shepperton Studios, Entley becomes sober. That meant this was more than just another acting job. It was a test. He needed to arrive every day, stay steady, and prove he could still function inside a major studio production where any collapse would be noticed immediately. That pressure can be felt in the performance. Oldman had more at stake than whether the movie succeeded. He needed to become dependable again, employable again, and he had to do it while carrying one of the most physically demanding roles in the film. Playing Doctor, Smith required long hours in makeup and prosthetics, sometimes 8 to 12 hours, before filming even began. For many actors, that is exhausting. For someone in early sobriety, it also demanded discipline from the moment he entered the chair. Sit still, stay focused, finish the day, then repeat it all again tomorrow. Once cameras rolled, he did not portray Smith as a simple cartoon villain. He gave the character vanity, manipulation, and that slick, self-preserving charm the role needed. But beneath it all, there is something harsher, a sense of corruption. As if Smith is not just plotting his way through the story, but being consumed by his own damage while doing it. In a movie packed with giant sets and heavy visual effects, that gave the character real bite. There was another reason Oldman wanted the role. At the time, he was a single father. After years of darker adult films, he liked the idea of appearing in something his children could actually watch. So Lost in Space gave him two things at once: a major studio role he needed professionally, and a film he could bring into his family life without carrying only dark, adult material with him. That may be why the performance feels so urgent. Much of the movie is trying to sell scale. Oldman is trying to hold ground, and Dr. Smith carries that desperation in nearly every scene. 5. The remake reached back to the original show, but not everyone came. Moves Entity movie, Lost in Space, the original television series. The movie brought in Entity Jarrett people, June Lockhart and Angela Cartwright, Amarta Kristen, Mark Goddard T gave the remake a visible connection to the classic show. It made the film feel less like a replacement and more like a handoff to a new generation, a signal that the movie still remembered where it came from. But the more revealing story is who chose not to participate. Entity people. Joe Jonathan Harris was approached for the film, but not to play Dr. Smith. Instead, production wanted him in another role connected to the sabotage storyline. Essentially, the man who would help launch the new version of Smith. Harris rejected the idea immediately. In his mind, there was only one Dr. Smith, and that was him. Director Entity People, St. Stephen Hopkins why, but Harris would not change his mind. He was too protective of the character to appear in the remake, while another actor wore Smith's identity. Then came Entity People, by Bill Mumy, original Will Robinson. His refusal carried a different kind of sting. He did not reject the project because he disliked it. He wanted one specific role, the older Will Robinson. It made perfect sense. His age matched the part, and it would have created a rare full-circle casting moment. The original Will returning as the future version of himself. But the studio reportedly did not want such a strong connection to the old series, especially after Harris had already stepped away. When Mumy did not get the one role that truly interested him, he walked away as well. So the remake received the easier kind of nostalgia, familiar faces, tribute cameos, quick appearances that told longtime fans the history was respected. What it never received was the full blessing of the two actors most deeply connected to its mythology. 6. The robot changed its body, but kept its soul. Completely different in the 1998 version of Lock Entity movie, Lost in Space Arbor. Less like a friendly piece of retro television machinery and more like something built for a late 1990s blockbuster. Its body was redesigned, the scale increased, and the machine was pushed toward a colder, more metallic style. Everything about it suggested danger and power rather than charm. But when it came to the voice, the film made one very smart decision. It brought back Entity People, Dick Tufeld, he original series. That gave the remake one direct connection longtime fans could recognize the instant the robot spoke. No explanation was needed. You could redesign the body, update the effects, and surround the character with an entirely new visual world. But the voice still carried the memory of the original show. That choice mattered because this version of the robot was not meant to feel exactly like the old one. The classic television robot had more personality, more theatrical energy, and that instantly recognizable Danger Will Robinson charm audiences remembered. The 1998 film wanted something tougher and more intimidating, matching the darker, larger-scale science fiction tone the movie was chasing. Same character, different temperature. So Tufeld's voice became the bridge between both versions. It stopped the robot from feeling like a total replacement. Audiences still heard something familiar coming from this larger, more aggressive redesign. Honestly, it may have been the smartest creative decision they made with the character. The body told viewers this was the blockbuster version. The voice reminded them the old robot was still somewhere inside. 7. The movie cut some of its weirdest ideas. Lost in space, it rushes past its own strangest concepts. That feeling is real. A surprising amount of unusual material was removed before the final release. One of the biggest losses involved Blarp. In the finished film, Blarp is a small, odd creature mostly hanging around the edges of the story. But the original plan went much further. Production reportedly created a full-grown adult version of Blarp as a complete animatronic puppet through Entity, Company, J. Jim Henson's Creature Shop 1E, and real production time had already been invested. It was not just an unused sketch. It had been built. There was more. The film also shot a final moment featuring an older Blarp aboard the Jupiter 2, clearly hinting at future danger and setting up sequel possibilities. That scene was cut as well, which makes sense once the studio began cooling on larger franchise ambitions. The time bubble sequence suffered even more trimming. In the released version, it plays like a contained sci-fi action set piece. Earlier concepts were reportedly far stranger, with extra portals leading to different environments and alternate possibilities. A thunder portal, a snow portal, multiple bizarre worlds inside one unstable event. The sequence originally aimed for something much more fractured and surreal than what audiences eventually saw. That helps explain the movie's final shape. The theatrical cut already feels oversized, but it is actually a pulled-back version of something even weirder. A giant animatronic Blarp, a sequel tease on the ship, a more chaotic time bubble filled with alternate spaces. All of it existed before the movie started cutting itself down. So, if parts of Lost in Space feel like they are missing a few strange steps in between, they probably are. 8. older Will Robinson was rebuilt in post-production. Strangest performance stories in Entity movie, Lost in Space, a Jared Harris ion of Will Robinson. He appeared on set, performed the role, and gave the character his own voice. You would assume that was the end of it. It wasn't. By the time the movie reached post-production, the filmmakers had started rebuilding the performance over him. The biggest issue was reportedly the voice. Producers felt Harris did not sound close enough to the younger Will Robinson. They also believed his delivery lacked the scale they wanted for the film's larger climax scenes. So they began replacing lines. Much of the new dialogue was dubbed by Entity people. LeBlanc everything became awkward. The movie did not fully keep Harris, and it did not fully replace him either. It did both at the same time. Harris later described the finished result as a Frankenstein version of himself, because only part of the original performance remained. The rest was another actor speaking through his face. That helps explain why the character can feel unusual on screen. In some scenes, older Will does not speak with one continuous voice. A single thought may shift between Harris and the dubbing actor, making the performance feel fragmented. The face remains the same. The body remains the same, but the voice keeps changing underneath it. The film cannot completely hide that surgery. There are moments where lip movements and audio no longer align smoothly. Viewers may not immediately understand what feels wrong, but they can sense it. The character sounds pieced together because he was. That is what makes the story so harsh. Jared Harris performed the role. Then the film kept reaching back in afterward, cutting, stitching, and adjusting, until older Will Robinson stopped feeling like one actor's performance and started feeling like post-production trying to repair one. 9. Critics saw the money, but not the magic like Entity movie, Lost in Space tee-off. Critics could see the budget. They could see the giant sets, the ambitious design, and the scale of the production. The opening space battle in particular caught attention immediately. For a few minutes, the movie looked exactly like what the studio had promised, a large, aggressive science fiction update with enough energy to make an old title feel dangerous again. Then the rest of the film had to maintain that momentum. That is where things began to slip. The biggest complaint was not that the movie looked cheap. It was the opposite. Many critics felt it confused size with excitement. More effects, more noise, more digital spectacle. But the larger everything became, the less grounded it often felt. Instead of pulling viewers deeper into danger, the film kept reminding them how much machinery was being thrown onto the screen. Once that sense of weightlessness appeared, the writing needed to do more work. It did not. That is when reviews became harsher. Entity, known celeb, Roger Ebert d 0.5 stars out of 4, and described it as a dim-witted shoot-'em-up filled with characters saying obvious things in obvious ways. That criticism landed because it aimed directly at the film's central weakness. The movie was not accused of lacking effort. It was accused of spending nearly all that effort on the surface. The tonal problem only made matters worse. The original television series had camp, oddness, and a scrappy kind of charm. The remake traded that for something heavier and more over-designed, yet never found a stronger personality to replace it. So the movie kept growing larger while feeling emptier. By the time the plot reached its more confusing turns, many critics had already checked out. They saw the money. They saw the ambition. They just did not feel much life underneath it. 10. It beat Titanic, then fell fast Entity movie, Lost in Space Kitori. It opened at number 1 and immediately did something the industry noticed. It knocked Entity movie to Titanic. That was no small achievement. Titanic had held first place for 15 straight weeks. Its dominance was so massive that people in the business even gave it a nickname, the iceberg. For a moment, Lost in Space looked like the real deal. Big opening numbers, big attention, big studio confidence. It had the kind of launch that makes a remake seem like it might become a genuine event. Then came the drop. Worldwide, the film earned around $136 million. At first glance, that sounds respectable. But once you compare it to the production budget, the marketing costs, and the franchise expectations, Entity, Company, and New Line Cinema, his story changes quickly. It was not a total disaster. In some ways, that was worse. It became something more frustrating, a one-weekend wonder. After that opening burst, the movie's reputation began splitting in two directions. Mainstream critics were often brutal. The film even received an Entity event, Golden Raspberry Awards remake, but genre audiences saw something different. It also picked up 6 Entity event, Saturn Awards WIIs, a lot about how science fiction fans viewed it. Maybe not as a great movie, but as one with ambition, strong design, and enough oversized late 1990s pulp energy to remain memorable. That split never fully disappeared. For many people who watched it young, Lost in Space did not survive in memory as a failed remake. It survived as that huge, glossy space adventure, with collapsing helmets, massive sets, the giant Jupiter 2, strange creatures, and expensive futuristic attitude that felt like pure 1998 science fiction. Sometimes that kind of memory lasts longer than reviews. It never became a critical classic. It became nostalgia, and fans kept it alive. 11. The franchise died before it began. Sea Drop did more than hurt Entity, movie, Lost in Space franchise plan before audiences ever saw where it was supposed to go next. Entity, Company, and New Line Cinema out just one movie. The cast reportedly had 3 picture options, which reveals the studio was already looking far beyond the first release. This film was meant to be the starting point, not the ending. One major science fiction property that could continue expanding if the first chapter succeeded strongly enough. And they were not only discussing Part 2. A sequel was already taking shape around the Robinson family finally reaching Alpha Prime, only to discover that humans were already living there. The twist was that the wormhole jump from the first movie had pushed the family into the future, making them late arrivals to the very colony they were originally meant to create. The follow-up would have explored even stranger ideas. Penny Robinson was expected to develop camouflage abilities similar to Blarp. Judy Robinson would have attempted to cure Dr. Smith's spider mutation. The sequel intended to lean harder into the weird side of the mythology. Then the plans grew even larger. New Line was also considering a live-action television series and an animated show. That means this was never about squeezing out one sequel. The studio wanted a full science fiction brand, films, television, merchandise, the whole machine. And every one of those ideas stalled in the same place. The sequel, the trilogy, the live-action expansion, the animated version. All of it became stranded in the narrow gap between a respectable hit and the kind of hit that makes a studio keep building. That is what makes the story sting. Lost in Space did not disappear because nobody cared. It disappeared because New Line wanted a franchise, and the first movie only delivered one weekend. 12. The Spider-Smith transformation was supposed to become a bigger story. T-moments in Entity Apocalypse. Movie. Lost in Space H mutates into the terrifying Spider-Smith. In the finished movie, it feels like a shocking final act twist designed to raise the stakes one last time. But behind the scenes, that transformation was meant to become something much larger. The sequel plans reportedly included Entity people, Judy Robinson, to reverse Smith's mutation. That means Spider-Smith was never intended to be just a one-movie monster reveal. It was supposed to continue into the next chapter as an ongoing storyline. That changes how the ending can be viewed. Instead of a final punishment for the villain, it was more like the beginning of a new problem. Smith surviving in mutated form would have given the franchise a continuing antagonist who was now even more dangerous and unstable than before. It also would have pushed the series deeper into body horror science fiction, far beyond the tone of the original television show. The remake was already darker and stranger than its source material, and Spider-Smith showed how far it was willing to go. But once the sequel plans collapsed, that larger story vanished with them. What remains is one bizarre transformation that feels sudden in the movie, because it was originally meant to continue after the credits. In the end, Spider-Smith became more than a villain twist. He became a glimpse of the weirder franchise audiences never got to see. 13. It became more popular after it failed things about Entity, movie, Lost in Space, and improved after it was already considered a disappointment. When the movie first arrived, many critics focused on the flaws: too much spectacle, uneven tone, confusing story turns, and a franchise dream that never fully launched. But time changed the way many viewers saw it. For audiences who grew up in the late 1990s, the film became something different. It was no longer judged as the remake that failed to become the next big sci-fi saga. Instead, it became remembered as a huge, glossy space adventure from a specific era of Hollywood excess. People remembered the collapsing helmets, the massive Jupiter 2, the heavy metal robot, Entity, known celeb Gary Oldman myth, the strange creatures, the oversized sets, that polished futuristic attitude that only late 1990s science fiction seemed to have. In other words, nostalgia rescued the movie the same way nostalgia helped create it in the first place. That happens more often than people realize. A film can fail in its own moment because audiences expect one thing, then survive later because new viewers want something else entirely. Lost in Space stopped being measured against what it was supposed to become and started being appreciated for what it actually was. It never transformed into a critical masterpiece, but it became a memory people enjoyed revisiting. Sometimes that is enough to give a movie a second life long after the box office is over. 14. The movie's biggest legacy was its unfinished dream. Movie Lost in Space ain't what it was. It is what it almost became. This was a film trying to be many things at once. A remake of a beloved television classic, a modern effects-driven blockbuster, a dark family adventure, and the launch point for a massive new franchise. You can feel all of those versions pulling against each other in nearly every scene. Somehow, that tension became the movie's identity. People remember the giant Jupiter 2, the retractable helmets, the metallic robot, Entity, known celeb Gary Oldman as Dr. Smith, the late 1990s belief that if you built a galaxy big enough, success would automatically follow. But success does not always work that way. The movie had money, ambition, effects, famous faces, sequel plans, television spin-off ideas, and merchandising hopes. It had everything except the one thing a studio cannot manufacture: lasting momentum. That is why the story still fascinates people. Lost in Space did not collapse because nobody cared. It collapsed because it aimed so high, came close enough to look real, and then stopped just short of becoming what it promised. In the end, the film's greatest legacy was not the franchise it launched. It was the unfinished dream audiences could still imagine. Sometimes the movies that almost became huge are remembered longer than the ones that actually did.